One meeting decided the fate of an entire continent. 14 countries sent representatives. Not one of them was African. By the time it ended, one man walked away owning a piece of land the size of Western Europe as his own personal property. This is the story of the Berlin Conference and the king who turned it into a graveyard. On November 15, 1884, delegates from 14 nations, Germany, Britain, France, Portugal, the United States, and others, gathered in Berlin at the invitation of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The meeting ran 104 days, breaking only for Christmas. On paper, the agenda was simple. Agree on rules for trade and territory in the Congo River Basin, and settle competing European claims before they turned into a war between European powers. When the delegates unrolled their map of Africa, the interior was still mostly blank. Nobody in that room had ever set foot in most of what they were about to divide up. They drew borders through it anyway. Straight lines, ruler drawn, cutting through kingdoms and language groups and communities that had existed for centuries before any of these men were born. At no point in 104 days did anyone ask a single African leader what they thought. Bismarck himself wasn't particularly interested in African colonies. He'd reportedly called them a luxury. Germany couldn't really afford. He hosted the conference anyway, because rival European powers were racing each other toward armed conflict over African territory, and a diplomatic framework to divide the spoils peacefully served Germany's interests far more than an actual war between European neighbors would have. The conference wasn't really about Africa, for most of the men in that room. It was about keeping Europeans from shooting each other over a continent none of them had asked to live on. King Leopold II of Belgium had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. He wasn't even acting on behalf of Belgium. His own government had refused to fund colonial ventures, so he built his own. He called it the International Association of the Congo and sold it to the rest of Europe as pure charity, an organization built to fight the slave trade and bring civilization to Central Africa. Not one delegate at that table asked him to prove it. The Berlin Conference recognized his association as the legitimate authority over the entire Congo basin, not Belgium's authority, his personally. When the conference ended on February 26, 1885, one man owned a private colony the size of Western Europe. He had never once set foot in it. He ran it from an office in Brussels. The humanitarian language didn't survive contact with the balance sheet. Global demand for rubber was exploding, bicycles, then automobiles, and the Congo basin was full of wild rubber vines. Leopold needed it harvested fast, and he wasn't going to pay real wages to get it. Villages were assigned rubber quotas they had no realistic way of meeting. Leopold's private army, the Force Publique, enforced them. If a village fell short, soldiers took hostages, usually women and children, and held them until the quota was paid. If it still wasn't paid, people were killed. To stop soldiers from wasting expensive imported ammunition on hunting instead of enforcement, officers required proof that every bullet had been used on a person. The proof was a severed human hand. It became official policy. When soldiers couldn't produce enough hands themselves, a grim secondary economy emerged. Hands were sometimes harvested from the living to make up the count, and villages were recorded raiding each other for the same reason, because their own quotas were impossible to fill any other way. On May 14, 1904, a man named Nsala walked to a nearby missionary station carrying a small bundle of papers. Rubber militia guards had visited his village the day before, found the quota not yet ready, and killed his wife, his son, and his 5-year-old daughter, Boali. Nsala had secretly kept his daughter's hand and foot as evidence before the guards could finish what they'd started. A missionary named Alice Seeley Harris photographed him staring down at what remained. That photograph went on to become one of the most widely circulated images of the entire Congo Free State era, reprinted in reports, shown in public slide presentations across Britain and America, even referenced years later in a Mark Twain satire about Leopold. A single photograph of one father, holding what was left of his daughter, did more to convince the outside world this was real than any report or statistic ever could. Leopold's force publique grew to nearly 19,000 troops, most of them Congolese men themselves, conscripted or coerced into enforcing the terror on their own communities. The violence wasn't the only killer. Disease tore through a population already displaced, malnourished, and forced away from their own farms to chase rubber quotas in the forest. In 1901 alone, an estimated 500,000 Congolese are believed to have died from sleeping sickness, a single disease outbreak, in a single year, in a population already being worked and starved past its limits. Nobody has ever put an exact number on it. There was no real census before Leopold's rule began, so there's no clean baseline to measure the loss against. The most cited estimate says the population was cut roughly in half between 1880 and 1920. 20 million people down to about 10 million. That's where 10 million comes from. Other historians push back hard on that number, arguing the evidence only supports something closer to 1 or 2 million. Nobody agrees on the number. Everybody agrees on the mechanism. Hostages, mutilation, forced labor, and the famine and disease that followed all of it. Count it high or count it low, it's still one of the deadliest colonial regimes in recorded history. Word got out slowly, then all at once. In 1890, an American journalist named George Washington Williams traveled through the Congo and published an open letter directly to Leopold, describing what he'd documented as crimes against humanity, one of the earliest recorded uses of that exact phrase. Williams called the territory a slave colony in all but name, and detailed specific practices. Laborers chained together for transport, children conscripted directly into Leopold's army, entire villages emptied by families fleeing rather than face the quota system. His letter was largely ignored at the time. It would take another 14 years, and a photograph like the one taken of Nsala, before the world stopped being able to look away. In 1904, the British consul Roger Casement traveled the Upper Congo himself. He interviewed survivors. He found villages where populations had collapsed from thousands of people down to a few hundred. His official report went straight to the British government, in flat, bureaucratic language. And that mattered because a government report wasn't something European power brokers could dismiss as rumor or missionary exaggeration the way they dismissed Williams. That same year, a British shipping clerk named E.D. Morel connected the final dot. He hadn't seen the Congo himself. He'd seen the shipping ledgers, cargo pouring out of the territory worth far more than anything being paid or shipped back in return. The math only worked one way. Somebody wasn't getting paid for their labor at all. Morel founded the Congo Reform Association that same year and turned the evidence into a sustained international campaign. It worked. The evidence had become too specific, too photographed, and too well documented for European governments to keep ignoring. In November of 1908, the Belgian government forced Leopold to give up personal ownership of the Congo. Before he handed it over, Leopold ordered the Congo state's administrative archives burned, destroying records that might have documented the full scale of what had happened under his rule. He was paid over 45 million Belgian francs in compensation for giving up the colony he'd never had any legal right to run as personal property in the first place. He died the following year, in 1909, a wealthy man. He is reported to have said, of the records he ordered destroyed, "They have no right to know what I did there." The territory became the Belgian Congo, a state-run colony instead of a private one. The worst of the specific atrocities eased. Colonial rule did not end. The map drawn in that room in Berlin by 14 men who had never seen the land they were dividing still largely defines the borders of Africa today. One meeting gave one king a country. Nobody has ever finished counting what it cost.